Hello all, my name is Dr. Jeanette Neiswinner, and this is an art appreciation lecture on the prehistoric Aegean. So we're talking about the Aegean Sea next to present-day Greece. When we're talking about the prehistoric Aegean, we're really referring to three cultures. So we're talking about the early Cycladic on the Cyclades Islands, the Minoans, who are primarily based on the island of Crete, and then the Mycenean culture, who is up on the Peloponnesian Peninsula. Say that 5 times fast. So these are not the cultures who are fighting the Persians and building the Acropolis. Instead, this is the pre-ancient Greek cultures, the prehistoric cultures, that have associations with some of the writings from later Greek culture. So we think of these as the settings for those later mythologies, such as the Iliad and the Odyssey. He was really thinking about these prehistoric cultures, sometimes the Mycenaeans. What we do know about these cultures that isn't necessarily steeped in this later mythology is that they are primarily seafaring island cultures with long trade routes and cultural exchange. So we can look at them trading with places like Mesopotamia and Egypt, but really also focusing on their use of local materials because they have some pretty good stuff readily available. So that material includes marble, which we'll see a lot of, and of course gold. The first culture to focus on is the Cycladic culture of the Cyclades Islands right here in the Aegean. So we think of present-day Athens right up here. This is Greece, the country of Greece. We are down here in these pink islands, best known for their marble sculpture. These marble sculptures would be placed in graves to accompany the dead into the afterlife. We think of these in art history as the beginning of the tradition of making figures in marble in Greece. So when you think of the later ancient Greeks, you probably think of marble sculptures and these very classical marble sculptures. Well, we think that tradition dates all the way back to 3000 BCE with the Cycladic culture. The Cycladic culture has marble readily available on their islands, especially this island of Naxos has an easily available marble quarry. You'll notice that today this island is called Santorini, also known as Thera. And this is one of those prehistoric Cycladic culture marble figurines or marble sculptures. The thing about these is that a lot of them have been found on the art market, so they've been looted and then they ended up on the art market. So we've lost a lot of the original archaeological context for these figures. They vary in a lot of ways. They vary in shape, they vary in height, they vary in width. They have some similarities in that they're primarily made of marble. We do believe they would have originally been painted. And they primarily show female figures. So the majority of them are female figures of varying sizes with a very closed composition. The arms that encircle the torso, standing very erect, even though these would have been found laying flat in graves. And this use of the triangle as a predominant shape in the composition. So the shoulders make the top of the triangle. They go down to the bottom. So you have kind of this triangle, the pubic triangle down here, the shield-like face. So these images might have been painted, probably were painted, might have been clothed, we're not quite sure. We're not quite sure of the original connotation or meaning of these. We do find female images with both male and female burials. So we're not quite sure what the association between the image and the interred individual was. We do also have male images of marble sculptures, and these are primarily doing something. So this figure is seated and playing a harp or a lyre. You get the sense that he is also singing, so his head is back, his mouth is tilted up. We get the sense that he is actively playing this musical instrument. We have fewer male figures than we have female figures, but the majority of the male figures are doing something, normally something related to music, such as playing a lyre, playing like a whistle, something like that. So they're more rounded in composition. We see these are more organic shapes, curvilinear shapes, less of an emphasis on those harsh triangles. Moving into the later Minoan culture, the Minoan culture, like we said, will focus down here on the island of Crete, specifically at the site of Naxos. However, the Minoan culture does include the Cycladic culture, which we just talked about, which are the pink islands. The Minoan culture has a lot of mythologies that surround their archaeological sites. Unfortunately, not as much archaeology there as we would like, but it has been subject to much more recent archaeological endeavors, thankfully. There were about 4 major urban centers on the island of Crete, and we call these palaces. These palaces are administrative, commercial, and religious centers. They are not just the home for wealthy individuals. A lot of these palaces are decorated using fresco painting, so the walls are decorated and painted in a fresco technique. One of the best known Minoan sites is the site of Akrotiri up here, present-day Santorini, because it was buried by a volcano in 1628. So volcanic eruptions are unfortunately very common in this area. When we're looking at Minoan palaces, you'll see that these are complex multi-story buildings. The Minoans are pretty ingenious in terms of their architectural styles and their architectural engineering. The Minoans, my favorite fact is that they had flushing toilets and sewage systems by 1600 BCE. Minoan palaces are based on having a large central plaza almost, and then having surrounding rooms off of that plaza, storerooms, like we said, administrative rooms, religious rooms, things like that. The complexity of these palaces led the excavator, Sir Arthur Evans, to consider this to be a labyrinth. There are a couple other reasons as well, but the easiest way to put it is this maze-like conglomeration of rooms looked like a labyrinth to Sir Arthur Evans in the early 20th century. So he believed he had found the place of the Minotaur. It was also just really good press, really good PR for people to become interested in what he was doing. So the Minotaur is one of these legends where King Minos' wife becomes pregnant from this bull, as happens in Greek mythology sometimes. She gives birth to a Minotaur who has the head of a bull and who thirsts for human blood. Therefore, King Minos demands sacrifices be sent from the mainland to his palace, his labyrinth, of so many young boys and girls to go in to be eaten by the Minotaur. As you can imagine, this does not last for too long because eventually this Greek hero, Theseus, becomes fed up and he says, I volunteer to go. He volunteers as tribute to go down to slay the Minotaur. He does so with the help of King Minos' daughter, Ariadne, who gives him a thread to unspool as he walks through the labyrinth, so that once his task is done, he can then just follow that thread back out of the labyrinth. He does this. He slays the Minotaur. He becomes a hero. He then sails home with Ariadne, and of course it's not happily ever after because it never is. He drops her off on a deserted island while she's sleeping. He continues back to his home on the mainland, but he forgets to change his sails. He had told his father that he comes home with black sails. That means he has not succeeded and he is dead. He sails in with black sails in all of his victory, completely forgetting about this, and his father is so distraught when he sees those black sails that he kills himself and Theseus becomes king. So again, in typical Greek fashion, there's no easy kind of, and then they lived happily ever after. So this is why we call this culture the Minoan culture, because it was thought to be the palace of King Minos. It was not, and a lot of these mythologies can have actually overshadowed the archaeological evidence that we have. The other thing that's overshadowed the actual archaeological evidence is the heavy amount of reconstruction that has taken place at these Minoan palaces in the 20th century. For example, this image, most of these are reconstructed columns, but they do give us a good idea of what the wooden columns of the Minoans would have looked like. So they would have tapered at the bottom and not had a base, with these kind of large cushion-like capitals at the top. They would have been made of wood, and we think everything in these palaces would have been brightly painted. You'll notice that this is the lower level of a stairwell in a residential area, and that you also have almost a cistern over here in the center in order to collect water when it rains. The other place that is always painted within these Minoan palaces are the upper levels. So a lot of the residential areas would have had these bright polychrome frescoes. These polychrome frescoes show a variety of information, not all of which we fully understand. We do have some writing from these periods. We have a linear A and linear B is what we call the writing systems. We only understand linear B. Linear A is still not able to be fully read. So we still have lots of questions in terms of the Cycladic and the Minoan cultures. We see here a bull leaping fresco, which is possibly a ceremony or activity that happened during the Minoan times. You have a bull with its 4 legs kind of leaping, and then 3 figures that possibly show us the 3 different stages of how you leap over a bull. That first figure pulling the bull's horns down, probably in order to then vault themselves up and over. And they do almost a handstand on the bull, and again, use that to then vault themselves off the tail end of the bull, and then kind of stand there in a little ta-da motion. This artwork has also been heavily reconstructed. You can see the reconstructed areas are everything that is this light blue, everything that does not look like a darker kind of puzzle. Minoan figures are frequently very elongated. They are very curvilinear, and the Minoan painting style uses a thick black outline. You can also see that Minoan figures have a very cinched waist, whether they are female or male. We're not quite sure what the color designations, what the difference in color between these 3 figures means. One interpretation is that the figures with the lighter skin are female, and those with the darker skin are male, since females would have not worked outside of the home, and men would. The men's skin might have been darker from the sun. This is also a common convention within Egyptian art. Egyptian art will also show that men's skin is darker than women's skin. Like we said, most Minoan paintings within the palaces are done in a fresco technique. All fresco means is that it's painting on plaster. It can either be a true fresco or a buon fresco, meaning that it is painting on wet plaster. Fresco secco is when you paint on dry plaster. Fresco secco, from a technical standpoint, is a much easier technique since you don't have to consider how much you can paint before the plaster dries. Fresco secco, however, will not adhere the paint to the plaster wall. Therefore, fresco secco is more of a fugitive technique. It will flake off, as opposed to bone fresco, which will last much longer. This is something, this is an image and a ceremony possibly that we see in multiple media. So we do also see this, as you can see in the top right, in sculpture. And you'll notice here that the figure's positioning on the bull is much different than the figure that we see on the left. So perhaps these were gymnasts, perhaps there were different ways, different moves of leaping over the bull. As we said, the Minoan people were seafaring island culture that had extensive trade networks. Within their pottery especially, we see this connection with the ocean and with marine life. So this marine style octopus jar shows us just that. Shows us the happiest little octopus I have ever seen, taking up the majority of a composition on this vessel. Most of these jars are cream in slip, cream in background, and they use a brown slip for the positive decorations. This vessel was made by actually making two bowls or plates first. So that's what you're seeing right here on the octopus face, is the little foot that had been made for the bowl. There's another identical one on the opposite side, and then the two were sealed together. I enjoy how the octopus really takes up the space here, and how the artist considered both the form and the function of this artwork when painting it. The octopus arms flow along that curvilinear shape of the vessel and mimic it in many ways so that the arms of the octopus do take up a majority of the space. The space that is not taken up by the octopus is taken up by the sea life, possibly like kelp or some sort of other marine vegetation that works to create this balance between the positive and negative space on the vessel. Vessels are not the only things being made out of kind of ceramic techniques by the Minoans. This is a snake goddess. She has been heavily reconstructed again after she was discovered. The interesting thing I find about her is that she's actually a good example of Minoan fashion and these big kind of flouncy tiered skirts that the Minoan culture would wear, but also the exposed breast style of the bodice. Her exact meaning, her exact kind of connotations are still up for debate many times. The other thing that is up for debate is this location of the feline on her head. Moving up to the Peloponnesus, we have the Mycenean culture. Mycenean culture is named after this city of Mycenae, but they have other cities as well where they are building fortified citadels. They are considered the first Greeks because they are the first large culture that we identify on the Greek mainland, and the later Greeks are going to look at some of their building techniques. However, they are very belligerent. They are constantly at war with other groups. We believe they occupied Crete, the Cyclades, and most of the Greek mainland, and that they are heavily influenced by the Minoans, who they of course encounter on Crete. The Mycenaeans are pretty obsessed with gold, and we have up to 30 pounds of gold being found just in one burial. So that's what we mean by lavish displays of wealth and power. This is one of those citadels with the large fortified wall around it. So when we're thinking about when you're thinking about a Mycenean citadel, you're thinking about this administrative and palace complex that is heavily fortified, and we can see the trajectory of someone actually entering the city of Tyreens here, that you would have to go up an approach ramp, through a gate, and then essentially walk the length of the city in order to actually get to the next gate. There are also multiple choke points that would enable the Myceneans to restrict access to the city or to go on top of the buildings and rain down arrows, boiling oil, anything like that onto the intruders below. So we see much more of a focus on defense with this building style than we saw at a site like Nasus with the Minoan culture. This is an artist's reconstruction of what is called a Megaron. The Megaron would be the throne room for the king. The king was called a Wanex. And we see that the Mycenaeans are adopting the Minoan columns, so that tall tapering column with no base and a pillow or cushion-like capital, but that they're also adopting this use of frescoes, possibly as wall decoration, and of course using lots of gold and marble. The other architectural innovation or architectural use is with corbelling, and corbelling very, very large stones without mortar. So that's what we're seeing here. These are called Cycloptic Architecture. And they are using corbelling, which is a system where you have each course of stone is placed a little bit closer, so it's cantilevered inwards, until the blocks meet at the top. So this creates these horizontal courses that then each get closer and closer and closer to one another until they touch at the top. So that's what we're seeing here used at the Lion's Gate in Mycenae. You're seeing that corbelling at the top. However, they also use the post and lintel system. So you have two posts down here and then a massive horizontal lintel right here. So when you use the post and lintel and corbelling together, you end up with an empty triangle above the lintel. This is called a relief triangle. And here that relief triangle is actually filled with a sculpture of two lions around a central column. We call this a heraldic composition. So these lions are symmetrically arranged around that central column. Again, we see that use of the Minoan column with the tapering shaft, no base, and that large cushion-like capital. We believe that the lions did originally have heads, and that those heads would have projected out from the back and possibly looked down at the viewer. Remember, this is one of those choke points where you could barricade the city. So they definitely wanted to display strength and wealth and power to whoever is entering this city. Those heads might have been made of a different material. They might have also been made by stone. What we're pretty sure of, though, is that they had been held on with some sort of wooden post, and that's why they no longer exist. You can also use corbelling in order to make a dome. So this is called a Beehive Tomb, and that's really what we found a lot of at Mycenae, are many, many tombs. This is the largest interior space without a support at this time. It is more beehive shaped. You can see it has more of a pointed or peaked roof than a true dome like we'll see later with the Roman Pantheon. And lastly, you do have what has previously been called the Mask of Agamemnon, which was really a 20th century archaeologist placing his ideas onto an earlier sculpture. This is a funerary mask made of beaten gold, meaning that the gold was hammered onto a form and therefore the gold took on that form. Some people have questioned if this has been reconstructed given the nature of the mustache. We do have others, though, that are much less decorative. You can see holes above and underneath the ears, which is possibly where the attachments were for this to be attached to the deceased's face. So these were found in funerary situations in graves attached to the interred individual. Again, the Myceneans have incredible amounts of wealth. So this local gold, up to, like we said, 30 pounds of gold within one burial. The Myceneans eventually, I kind of think of, they kind of wear themselves out. All of this fighting and infighting can't last forever. And it does, at the end of the Mycenaean period, plunge Greece into what's thought of as the Dark Ages, where there's no more large buildings, no more elaborate luxury goods are being produced, not as much trade or seafaring. And that really is the dividing point between the Mycenaean culture and what we talk about as later the ancient Greek city-states of such as Sparta or Athens. So thank you so much for your time.